Welcome to our class on creating great content and language objectives. During the course of this video, we're going to discuss the components of a content and language objective, look at a few examples, and at the end, you will have an opportunity to create your own content and language objectives for your lesson plan. Let's first look at the components of content and language objectives. One of the key pieces of the language piece of the objective is the language function. The language function is the purpose of the language that students are using. Typically things like describe, compare and contrast, explain, predict, and justify. It's the purpose that we're using our language for. Some of the key functions that kids see in academic work are some of the ones listed here, with the top 5 being describe, compare and contrast, cause and effect, proposition and support, and sequence. Once I've thought through the function of language my students need, the next piece is to think about the form of language. The form of language can refer to the grammatical structure or grammatical components of language that students need. It's more specific than the function. It's the small pieces that help us know what function we are operating in. A form of language could also be vocabulary that students are using. Then, for our purposes in this course, we are going to write content and language objectives together instead of separating just language and just content. So if I was only writing a language objective, I would have to have function and form. But since I'm also including content, we're going to have a content stem. And because WIDA is our driving force, we are going to think about the supports in our objectives as well. The content stem is simply your task or topic that students are learning about. Then you should be familiar with WIDA supports, graphic, sensory, and interactive. Those are the supports that you think are going to be most critical in your lesson. Let's look at a few formulas that will help you write content and language objectives. At the top, this is your formula. It might look something like, I can use language forms in order to do this function, content stem, with the support or help of some type of WIDA support. The other option is to flip the order around a bit and talk about the function and content stem first, then talk about students using certain language forms to do so with the help of some kind of WIDA support. Let's look at an example. So if I use the first formula to write my content and language objective, where I'm putting the language form first and then I'm adding my function and content stem, it might sound like I can use descriptive adjectives in order to describe a character in a book with the support of a word bank. Breaking this down a bit, descriptive adjectives are the language form. Describe is the function, it's the purpose of the language. A character in a book is the content stem. And the WIDA support here that I'm using is a word bank. Let's look at another example with the order changed a bit. In this example, I would put the function first in my objective, and then the forms would follow. So thinking of the same objective we just looked at, but just putting it in a different order, I can describe a character in a book using descriptive adjectives with the support of a word bank. In this example, I put the function first, which is describe, the content stem following that, which is a character in a book, the language forms, which are descriptive adjectives, and the biggest support I believe that will help my students here is a word bank. We're going to take a few moments and look at some examples. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause this video so that you can work on your own to determine in each of these, can you find the function, the forms, the content stems, and supports. If it helps you, you may want to use the color code at the top of the page for each of those parts. So take an opportunity right now to pause this video and see if you can identify each of the components of a content and language objective in these 5 examples here. Let's go over what you found. So in this example, I can use first, next, then last to retell a fiction story with the support of a graphic organizer. First, next, then, and last are the language forms that students need in order to do the function of retell. The content being focused on is a fiction story, and the support here is a graphic organizer. Check your work and see how you did. Let's take a look at the next one. I can predict how many pattern blocks fill a shape using I think, I predict, I expect. Students will use sentence frames to express their prediction. In this example, the function comes first in the language objective. Neither is right or wrong. Simply choose the formula that works best for you. So here, the function is predict. How many pattern blocks fill a shape is the content. I think, I predict, I expect is the language forms. And sentence frames are the main support here. Here's the next example. Take a moment and look at the color bank above and see how you did with this example. Let's take a look at the fourth one. Again, notice how in this example, the teacher has chosen to put the forms first and then the function follows it. Again, neither is right or wrong. Simply create these in a way that makes the most sense to you and your students. In the last example, I want to point out a few things that the teacher did with the language forms. So note here, I can use adjectives, tall, short, skinny. Adjectives is the technical name of the language form, and you can certainly point this out to your students. But notice how the teacher in parentheses also put tall, short, skinny. These are the actual adjectives she's hoping they will use in the lesson. Whenever we can be more explicit like this with students in their objectives, it helps them get a better idea of the language that we are wanting them to use. You could think about writing your objectives this way. Similarly, if we look at the one right above with because and so, technically the language form here would be conjunctions. That's the grammar word for it. So you could say, I can use conjunctions to explain cause and effect. Or you could do what the teacher did in the last example. You could say, I can use conjunctions and then in parentheses because and so, since those are the actual conjunctions you're hoping students use. So you can think about language forms in a few different ways, either teaching your students the actual grammatical name, or giving them the language or the words that they would actually say, or putting them both together. Here are some examples from some classrooms. Most of these are just language objectives, but it can help you to see function and forms of language. In ours, as I said before, we are going to add the content stem and the supports. So if we look at this one, we can retell. Retell is the function. Events, that would be the content, using past tense. Past tense is your language form in this example. And then you can see that the teacher listed some of those past tense verbs, ran, built, and blew. Here's another example. I can state an opinion using I think and because. In this example, stating an opinion is the function, and the forms are I think and because. If the teacher was to add content to this, it would be about everyday things, and if she was to add a support, it would most likely be either this word bank or the sentence frame. Here's another example. Take a moment and see if you can figure out what the function and the form and possible supports would be. Here's another. Notice here that the function is compare and contrast. The forms of language are both differently in whereas, which again are conjunctions, so the teacher could have noted that, but if this is more comprehensible to your students, that is great too. Here's another example. This PowerPoint is available to you through World Class if you ever need to go back and quickly look at some of the examples we've seen today. Now let's look at how this will support you in writing an objective on your lesson plan. Pull out your lesson plan beside you right now so that you can see the template as we go along. You will notice the top portion of your lesson plan, which says Content and Language Objectives. This is basically a help sheet for you. You are going to highlight the main functions, the main forms, and the main supports on this top portion, which is your help sheet. Once you've highlighted these areas, it will quickly help you write your language objective. So let's start with the function. Once you have written out a proficient example of what students will do, it's often very easy to figure out what the main function is. Typically, you will come up with one and possibly two dominant functions. You only want to pick one or two to make it as clear to students as possible. So narrow it based on what you believe is the most language being used. So in this example, we're going to say that the main function was classify. So once that's determined, you can either highlight that on your plan or circle it. The next piece is to think about the language form. Remember, the form are the smaller components of language that are really going to help students meet that function. So in this case, students are going to use adjectives. Again, typically you have one, possibly two key forms. Simply circle or highlight the main one for you here. Finally, you're going to think about supports. We've organized these with graphic, sensory, and interactive. These are ideas that you can use below. With any piece of this help sheet, if your function or grammatical feature or support isn't on here, simply add it. So once you've determined the main support in your lesson, circle or highlighted it. Now you should have 3 pieces circled. This will make it very easy for you to write your language objective. So let's look at what we have. We have classify, adjectives, and graphic organizer. In the purple box, you can see how the teacher took each one of these using the formula to help her create this objective. First, she took the function of classify. Students will classify attributes of reptiles, mammals, and amphibians. Reptiles, mammals, and amphibians are the content stem, which is not included in the help sheet because it changes so much based on your topic. But you will know what the main content piece is for your students. Then you'll see that she adds using adjectives, and she gives an example there, warm-blooded and cold-blooded. Adjectives is what she had circled under grammatical features. And then with the help of a graphic organizer. Graphic organizer is what was marked under supports. You can see how once you've highlighted or circled these areas, it's very easy to plug them into the formula so that you have all of the important components of your content and language objective. Now take an opportunity to apply this learning to your own lesson plan. Continue planning your vocabulary lesson. Before you write your objective, make sure that you have already determined some of the key language pieces from our process the other day. You should have already thought through if students were to meet your main objective, what would their response sound like either in writing or speaking? Then from that response, you should have a proficient and one other language level. From there, you will be determining what is the key vocabulary, what might be sentence frames, and you should have already started thinking about what the dominant function is. A little hint, what comes up in those sentence frames and vocabulary are probably going to help you figure out what your main language form is. So take some time now to begin planning your own lesson objective. Follow any extra instruction on your class agenda.